Imagine lying down right now, your eyes growing heavy, as I take you back, not to a battlefield, not to a royal court, but to a quiet room, somewhere in 11th century England, where a woman is sitting by candlelight, pulling a needle through linen, one stitch at a time, telling the story of a war that changed the entire world. She has no camera. She has no paper. She has only thread. And what she and others like her created over years of silent, patient work is a 230-foot marvel that historians are still arguing about today. Stay with me tonight, because this is not just the story of an embroidery. This is the story of how ordinary hands preserved an extraordinary moment in human history, and why the quietest art form ever created might also be the most powerful. Pull your blanket a little closer. Let your breathing slow, because we're going all the way back to the year 1066, and we're going to take our time getting there. There is something deeply soothing about the idea of someone sitting quietly and stitching. In our world of noise and speed and flashing screens, the image of a needle rising and falling, thread looping through fabric, a design slowly emerging from nothing. It is almost impossible to imagine. But for centuries, this was not unusual work. This was how stories were told. This was how history was recorded. Not in ink, not in stone, in wool thread, dyed in shades of terracotta and sage and gold and midnight blue, pulled through bleached linen with a bone needle, stitch by careful stitch. The object we are talking about tonight is most commonly known as the Bayeux Tapestry. And right away, before we go any further, we need to address something small but important, because historians love to argue about this. It is not technically a tapestry. A true tapestry is woven. The design is created as the fabric itself is made. The threads interlock during the weaving process. What we have at Bayeux is an embroidery. The linen fabric was made first, plain and blank, and then the images and words were stitched onto its surface afterward. The threads were applied on top. So technically, scholars prefer to call it the Bayeux embroidery. But the world has called it a tapestry for so many centuries that the name has stuck, and most people, even experts, use both terms freely. Tonight, we will too. But the name matters less than the thing itself. And the thing itself is astonishing. It is 70 meters long. That is nearly 230 feet. If you stretched it out in a straight line, it would reach from one end of a football field to nearly the other end and keep going. It is about half a meter tall, roughly 20 inches, and it tells, in nearly continuous pictorial sequence, the story of how William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel in 1066 and defeated King Harold of England at the Battle of Hastings. It contains over 600 human figures. There are horses, 202 of them, in fact. There are ships, castles, banquets, weapons, religious ceremonies, comets blazing across embroidered skies, and creatures both real and fantastical lurking in the decorative borders along the top and bottom edges. There is a woman being struck, there are men feasting on roasted meat, there are soldiers wading through water up to their knees holding their shields above their heads. And there is a single frame, quiet and devastating, showing a man with an arrow in his eye, which generations of historians have debated as possibly representing the death of King Harold himself. It is a comic strip. It is a newsreel. It is propaganda. It is history. It is art. It is all of those things at once, and it has survived for nearly 1,000 years. Let that settle for a moment. 1,000 years. The thread that was pushed through that linen fabric by human hands, hands that have long since returned to dust, is still intact, still colored, still telling its story in the quiet museum in the city of Bayeux in Normandy, France, where it lives today, behind glass, in a darkened room, coiled into its long display case like something sleeping. Now let us begin at the very beginning. Not the beginning of the tapestry's story, but the beginning of the story it tells. Because to understand what was stitched, we need to understand why it mattered. The year is 1064, and England is ruled by King Edward, whom history will call Edward the Confessor. Edward is a pious, scholarly man who spent much of his life in exile in Normandy, and he has deep personal connections to the Norman court across the Channel. He has also, historians believe, made some kind of promise, or at least strongly implied some kind of intention, regarding who should succeed him as King of England. The throne of England was not, in this era, simply inherited by the eldest son. It was technically elected by a council of nobles called the Witan, though in practice, a dying king's wishes carried enormous weight. And Edward, who had no children, was going to have to make his wishes known. The man who would benefit most from a Norman succession was William, Duke of Normandy. William was a formidable figure, illegitimate by birth, which earned him the nickname William the Bastard among his enemies, but ferociously capable as a ruler and military leader. He had survived multiple assassination attempts in his early life. He had united Normandy under his iron control, and he believed, with absolute certainty, that Edward had promised him the English throne. Meanwhile, back in England, there was another candidate. Harold Godwin's son was the most powerful earl in England, the son of the legendary Earl Godwin, and the brother-in-law of King Edward himself. Harold was English, Harold was popular, Harold was respected, and Harold, in the view of most English nobles, was the obvious choice to be king when Edward died. The tapestry begins its story with a visit that Harold makes to the Norman court. He sails across the Channel, is captured briefly by a local lord, is rescued by William, travels with William on a military campaign in Brittany, and then, in the scene that would set the entire conflict in motion, Harold swears an oath. The oath is depicted in the tapestry with tremendous dramatic emphasis. Harold stands with his hands on two reliquary boxes, sacred objects containing holy relics, and he swears something to William. The exact words are not recorded, but the implication of the tapestry is clear. Harold is swearing to support William's claim to the English throne. He is making a promise on holy relics, which in the 11th century was about as binding and serious a vow as a human being could make. Then Harold goes home, and when Edward the Confessor dies in January of 1066, Harold accepts the crown of England for himself. From William's perspective, and the tapestry is, without question, largely told from William's perspective, this was an act of profound, unforgivable treachery. Harold had sworn an oath on holy relics and then broken it. He had betrayed not just a man, but God himself. The Norman invasion that followed was not, in this telling, mere conquest. It was righteous punishment for a sacred oath breaker. Whether or not that oath was truly freely given, whether Harold swore under duress, or whether he swore something less binding than William claimed, or whether the whole story was partly a Norman fabrication to justify invasion. These are questions that historians have argued about for centuries. But the tapestry presents its version of events with absolute confidence and extraordinary visual clarity. Now pause for a moment. Breathe. Feel the quiet around you. We are going to slow down here, because we have been talking about the story the tapestry tells. But I want to take you to something deeper, something quieter. I want to take you into the room where the tapestry was made. Because here is the thing that most people, when they think about this object, do not spend enough time considering. Someone made this. Many someones, most likely. Human hands, probably women's hands, though this too is debated, sat with this linen spread across their laps or stretched across a frame, and they stitched. Day after day, week after week, month after month, possibly year after year. They pushed needles through fabric. They counted stitches. They corrected mistakes. They dyed wool thread in colors extracted from plants and minerals, weld for yellow, woad for blue, madder for red and orange, and they pulled those colored threads through the weave of the cloth in a technique called stem stitch and laid work and split stitch and couching, building up figures and horses and ships and flames and forests one thread at a time. This is the part of the tapestry story that is most easily overlooked, because we live in a world where images appear instantly, where a photograph captures a battle scene in a fraction of a second, where a printing press can reproduce 1,000 copies of an illustration in an afternoon. We have lost our intuitive understanding of how long it takes to make an image by hand. So let us think about it together. The tapestry is approximately 230 feet long. It contains, as we said, hundreds of figures, animals, ships, buildings, trees, and more than 2,000 individually embroidered letters forming the Latin text that runs above many of the scenes. Every horse in that tapestry, all 202 of them, had to be outlined in thread, then filled in with color, legs and mane and tail and harness all individually rendered. Every human figure had to be stitched. Every castle wall, every wave beneath every ship. Scholars who have studied the needlework closely have identified that the embroidery was almost certainly made by multiple hands, probably a team of skilled needleworkers rather than a single person, and that it was likely produced in England rather than in Normandy, probably in the city of Canterbury, which was in this period a major center of embroidery production. English needlework of this era was so famous on the continent that it had its own name, Opus Anglicanum, Latin for English work. It was considered the finest embroidery in Europe, perhaps in the world. But even with a team of skilled workers, the scale of this project was staggering. Some scholars have estimated that producing the full embroidery would have required between 8 and 15 years of continuous labor. Others think it could have been done faster with a large enough team. But even the most optimistic estimates involve thousands and thousands of hours of sustained, careful, quiet work. Imagine that. Imagine sitting in a scriptorium or a workshop, the light coming through narrow windows, the sound of thread being drawn through linen filling the silence. You are stitching a horse. You have stitched 40 horses before this one. You will stitch 100 more. Each one must be recognizable as a horse. Each one must carry its rider correctly. Some are rearing. Some are fallen. Some are dead on a battlefield with arrows in their sides. You stitch them all. You stitch them slowly. You have no photographs to copy from. You are working from drawings or designs prepared by an artist, probably drawn in ink directly onto the linen surface, and your job is to cover those drawn lines with thread to make them permanent, to make them vivid. You are making history permanent, one stitch at a time. The person or people who commissioned this extraordinary work remain a subject of some debate, though the leading candidate for many centuries has been Odo of Bayeux. Odo was the half-brother of William the Conqueror, the Bishop of Bayeux, and one of the most powerful men in post-conquest England. He appears multiple times in the tapestry itself. It is thought that the figure labeled Odo, depicted eating at the great feast before the battle and rallying troops during the fighting, is indeed a self-portrait of sorts, embedded into the narrative by the patron himself. The tapestry is believed to have been commissioned by Odo for the dedication of his newly rebuilt Bayeux Cathedral in 1077, just 11 years after the events it depicts. This timeline is important. 11 years. There would have been people still alive who had fought at Hastings. There would have been men who had seen Harold's face in person, who had watched the Norman ships cross the Channel, who had stood on the ridge above Senlac Hill and heard the battle cries begin. The tapestry was not made in remote historical memory. It was made in living memory. The people who stitched it may have known soldiers who fought. The designers who planned its scenes may have spoken to eyewitnesses. This closeness to events, this documentary freshness, is part of what makes the tapestry so extraordinary as a historical source. But it also means we must read it carefully, because a source made 11 years after events, commissioned by the half-brother of the victorious king, presented in the cathedral of the man who commissioned it. This is not a neutral record. This is history written by the winners. The tapestry tells us, with great confidence and tremendous visual skill, the Norman version of what happened in 1066. It tells us why William was right. It tells us why Harold was a traitor. It tells us why the conquest was just. And yet, despite all of this, the tapestry is not as simple as pure propaganda. There are moments in it, small, quiet moments, that seem to tell a slightly different story. Small details that humanize Harold, that show English warriors fighting with extraordinary bravery, that do not entirely erase the tragedy of what was lost. Whether these moments were deliberate, whether English needleworkers, stitching this story under Norman instruction, quietly inserted small acts of sympathy for their own people, is something we will never know for certain. But the possibility is there, and it makes the tapestry even richer, even more layered, even more human. Let your body sink a little deeper now. Let your mind rest on these images. A woman at a frame, a needle rising and falling, the soft sound of thread through linen. We will continue. The political situation in 1066 was, by the standards of medieval history, unusually complicated. Because when Harold took the throne of England in January of that year, he did not face just one rival. He faced three. William of Normandy was the most famous and ultimately the most consequential. But there was also Harold Hardrada, Harold the Hard Ruler, King of Norway, who believed he had a claim to England through a complicated line of dynastic succession going back to an agreement between an earlier Norwegian king and an earlier English king. Harold Hardrada was one of the most feared warriors of his age, a man who had fought in Constantinople, in the Mediterranean, in the eastern lands. He was enormous in stature and reputation. And in the autumn of 1066, he sailed for England with a fleet of 300 ships. And then there was Tostig Godwin's son, Harold's own brother. Tostig had been Earl of Northumbria, but his rule had been harsh, and he had been expelled by his own people in a rebellion, and Harold, as king, had not restored him. Tostig was furious. Tostig allied himself with Hardrada. Tostig sailed south along the English coast, raided, and eventually joined the Norwegian forces in the north. Harold, King Harold of England, the man who had sworn an oath on holy relics and possibly broken it, or possibly had it forced from him, depending on who you believed, suddenly found himself fighting a war on two fronts. He marched north with extraordinary speed. His army covered ground at a rate that historians still marvel at. In September of 1066, Harold's forces met the combined armies of Hardrada and Tostig at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, near York. The English won a devastating victory. Both Harold Hardrada and Tostig were killed. The Norwegian threat was eliminated. Harold had just saved England from Norwegian conquest. Then the messenger arrived. William had landed in the south. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy crossed the English Channel with an army of approximately 7,000 men, knights, archers, infantry, and landed at Pevensey on the Sussex coast. He had been waiting for weeks for the right winds. Now he was here. Harold turned his exhausted, bloodied army around and marched south again. Historians have debated ever since whether this was a strategic error. Did Harold move too quickly? Should he have rested his troops, gathered more forces, waited? Perhaps. But Harold moved fast. He gathered what reinforcements he could along the way. He reached London, paused briefly, and then pushed south toward the Norman position. On the 14th of October, 1066, the two armies met at a location near Hastings. The English held the high ground, on a ridge above a valley. Harold's army formed a shield wall, a traditional English defensive formation, soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder with shields overlapping a near-impenetrable barrier of wood and iron. The Normans attacked uphill. It was a long battle. It lasted, by most accounts, from roughly 9 in the morning until dusk. The Normans attacked repeatedly. The shield wall held. There were moments, early in the fighting, when it seemed Harold might actually prevail. A rumor swept through the Norman ranks that William had been killed, and the Norman lines began to waver. William threw back his helmet so his men could see his face. He He rallied them. They pressed on. Then something shifted. The English shield wall began to break. Whether the English made a tactical error, chasing retreating Normans downhill and breaking their own formation, or whether the battle simply turned on exhaustion and attrition and the devastating effect of Norman archers, is something historians still debate. But by evening, the English lines were crumbling, and Harold was dead. The tapestry records his death in one of its most famous and most argued about scenes. A figure falls with what appears to be an arrow in or near his eye, and above him the embroidered Latin text reads, Harold Rex Interfectus Estate. King Harold is killed. The arrow in the eye story has become one of the most iconic images of the entire medieval period. And it may be true, or it may be a later interpretation of a scene that was originally showing something slightly different. The threads of the tapestry in that particular area have been repaired and restitched over the centuries, making it difficult to know with certainty exactly what the original image showed. But Harold was dead. That much is certain. The last Anglo-Saxon king of England died on a ridge in Sussex as the October sun went down, and with him died the world that had produced him. William marched to London. He was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. Now breathe. Let that history settle around you like a blanket. Let your eyes feel heavy, because we have been telling the story that the tapestry tells. But now I want to take you somewhere even quieter. I want to take you into the tapestry itself, into the details, into the margins. Because one of the most extraordinary things about the Bayeux embroidery is what is happening at the edges. Along the top and bottom of the main narrative frieze run decorative borders. And in these borders, strange and wonderful things are occurring that have nothing directly to do with the Norman Conquest. There are animals, lions and bears, and what appear to be griffins and strange hybrid creatures, half bird and half beast. There are scenes from Aesop's fables, the fox and the crow, the wolf and the crane. There are farmers plowing fields. There are naked figures that scholars have politely described as eroticized, and less politely described as frankly explicit. There are scenes of falconry and hunting. There are men fighting with clubs. Why are these things here? What do they mean? Some scholars believe the border imagery is purely decorative, that the needleworkers were simply filling space with imagery they found appealing or culturally familiar, without any deeper symbolic intention. Others argue that the border scenes are deeply meaningful, that the fables are deliberately chosen to comment on the main narrative above, that the story of the fox who flatters the crow into dropping its food is a comment on Harold being flattered by William, for example, or on William being clever and Harold being foolish. There is a scene in the lower border, just below the Battle of Hastings, that shows figures stripping armor from the bodies of dead soldiers. This is not glamorous. This is not heroic. This is the real business of medieval warfare, the looting that followed every battle, the practical salvage of expensive iron and leather from men who would never need them again. Nobody told the needleworkers to put this in. Or if they were told, someone made that choice consciously. Someone decided to show this truth. These border details are where the humanity of the tapestry lives most freely. The main narrative is controlled, purposeful, propagandistic. But the borders are wilder, stranger, more personal. They feel like the margins of a medieval manuscript, where monks and scribes sometimes drew tiny drawings of themselves, or small jokes, or observations that had nothing to do with the holy text they were copying. They feel like the places where the makers of the tapestry were allowed, or quietly allowed themselves, to be themselves. Who were these makers? We do not know their names. We have no documents that record who stitched the Bayeux embroidery. We know that skilled needlework in this period was largely a female occupation, though monks also embroidered, and there were male professional embroiderers. We know that Canterbury, where the tapestry was probably made, had embroidery workshops attached to its great monasteries. We know that the quality of the stitching indicates serious professional skill. This was not amateur work. not a group of noble women stitching for pleasure, but trained workers executing a complex and detailed design. Some historians have proposed that the tapestry might have been made in part by women in the household of Odo of Bayeux, or in a royal workshop, or in a monastic setting. Some have even speculated, romantically and without firm evidence, that women who had lost husbands or brothers or fathers at Hastings might have stitched scenes of a battle that had destroyed their world. There is no evidence for this, but the thought lingers. The thought that grieving English hands might have stitched Norman glory, that the losers made the monument to the winner's victory, has a particular kind of heartbreaking resonance. What we know for certain is this: those hands were patient. Whatever they felt, pride, grief, boredom, religious devotion, professional satisfaction, simple exhaustion, they were patient. They sat and they stitched. They made something that would last 1,000 years. And that patience is perhaps the deepest theme of everything we are talking about tonight. Let us rest here for a little while. Let the images come gently. A candle burning low. The sound of thread. Outside the window, the 11th century is going about its business. Oxen in fields, bells from a distant church tower, the smell of wood smoke on cold autumn air. Inside, the needle rises and falls. The tapestry grows, inch by inch, yard by yard, story by story. We will move forward now, into the centuries, into what happened to this extraordinary object after it was made. The tapestry was almost certainly displayed in Bayeux Cathedral for many years after its creation, probably hung around the nave during feast days and celebrations, unrolled and spread out for worshippers to walk along and read. This was a clever choice of location and use. In the 11th century, very few ordinary people could read Latin, or read at all. The tapestry's visual narrative, with its clear figures and sequential action, was readable by anyone who could see it. It was, in a sense, a pictorial Bible of current events, a stained glass window in fabric form, telling the story of God's endorsement of William's conquest in images that anyone could understand. For the first few centuries after its creation, the tapestry seems to have lived quietly in Bayeux, appearing in inventories and documents occasionally, confirming that it was still there, still hanging, still being cared for. A 1476 inventory of the cathedral treasury describes it in terms that are clearly recognizable as the tapestry we know today. The tapestry survived the 100 Years' War, the religious conflicts of the Reformation, and various other upheavals that destroyed so many medieval artifacts. But the 18th century brought the tapestry a new kind of danger. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, was not kind to religious institutions or their treasures. Bayeux Cathedral, like all French churches, found itself in danger. Revolutionary authorities confiscated church property. In Bayeux, at some point in the 1790s, the tapestry was removed from the cathedral and used, and here we pause to let the horror of this sink in, as a covering for a military wagon. This astonishing, irreplaceable, 900-year-old embroidery was about to be used as a tarpaulin for army supplies. It was rescued. A local official, a man named Lambert Leonard Leforestier, reportedly intervened and had the tapestry removed from the wagon. The details of exactly how this rescue happened are somewhat hazy. It may have been slightly dramatized in the retelling, but the basic fact is that the tapestry was saved from this particular indignity and was subsequently recognized as something that needed to be protected. Napoleon Bonaparte saw the tapestry in 1803 when it was brought to Paris as part of a tour of French cultural treasures. He was apparently fascinated by it. The story of William's Channel crossing and conquest of England was obviously resonant for a man who was himself contemplating an invasion of England at that very moment. Napoleon ordered the tapestry displayed publicly in Paris, where it attracted enormous crowds. The invasion of England did not happen. The tapestry returned to Bayeux. And then the Second World War came. In 1940, German forces occupied France. The Nazis had a well-documented interest in cultural artifacts and historical objects, particularly those that could be used to construct narratives of Germanic or Nordic cultural superiority or historical legitimacy. The tapestry, depicting the conquest of England by what the Nazis chose to frame as a Germanic people, the Normans being of Viking descent, and Vikings being, in this distorted telling, Proto-Aryans, attracted the attention of Heinrich Himmler and his SS division devoted to cultural heritage, the Ahnenerbe. There are documented instances of Nazi officials visiting Bayeux and examining the tapestry. There are records suggesting it was moved for safety to the Château de Sorches and later to the Louvre as the war progressed. There are documented requests from Nazi authorities to have it sent to Berlin for study. These requests were, ultimately, not fulfilled. In August of 1944, as Allied forces liberated France and Paris fell, there was a desperate last-minute effort by German cultural officers to remove the tapestry to Germany. This effort failed. The Louvre was liberated. The tapestry remained in France. It returned to Bayeux. It returned to its quiet museum. It returned to its glass case and its darkened room. And there it remains. Let that breathe for a moment. 950 years of survival. Survived the Norman Conquest it depicts. Survived the 100 Years' War. Survived the Revolution. Almost used as a wagon tarpaulin. Almost taken to Berlin. And still there. Still intact. Still telling its story in wool and linen, in terracotta and sage and gold and blue. The colors, incidentally, have faded somewhat from what they would have been originally. When the tapestry was new, it would have been far more vivid, the reds brighter, the blues more intense, the yellows more golden. What we see today is a slightly muted version of the original, like a painting that has spent centuries in gentle light. But the essential palette is preserved. The essential imagery is intact. And the imagery, studied closely, gives us extraordinary information about the 11th century that we would not have from written sources alone. Historians and archaeologists have used the tapestry as a detailed reference for the arms and armor of the period. The shields carried by Norman knights, kite-shaped, designed to protect the leg while on horseback, are depicted with remarkable consistency and accuracy. The chain-mail hauberks worn by the warriors, the helmets with their distinctive nasal guards, the swords and spears and bows, all are shown in such detail that they have informed our understanding of 11th century military equipment in ways that no written description could match. The ships that carried William's army across the Channel are depicted with such accuracy that marine historians have used the tapestry as evidence for the design of 11th century vessels. The ships have distinctive curved prows, square sails, and side rudders, and enough structural detail that modern shipbuilders have actually constructed replica vessels based largely on the tapestry's images. The food at the feast depicted just before the battle, Harold feasting with his nobles. The Normans feasting on the beach before Hastings includes recognizable dishes and utensils that have helped food historians understand what people ate and how they ate it in this period. There are buildings depicted, towers, churches, palaces, that give us visual evidence for architectural styles that few actual structures from this period have survived to demonstrate. And then there is the comet. In April of 1066, just months before the conquest, Halley's Comet made one of its periodic appearances in the night sky, and the tapestry records it. In one of the most famous single images in the entire embroidery, a bright comet is shown blazing across the sky above a group of startled English observers pointing upward, while in the scene below, Harold sits on his throne looking troubled, and in the border below that, ghostly shapes of ships are visible, as if appearing in a vision or an omen. This was not simply a decorative choice. In the medieval world, comets were signs. They were messages from God, portents of great events, warnings of what was to come. The appearance of a comet in the sky above England in the spring of 1066 was understood by everyone who saw it as a sign that something momentous was about to happen. The tapestry includes this comet deliberately, as part of its argument that the Norman Conquest was divinely foretold and approved. But for us, centuries later, it is also something else. It is a record of a real astronomical event, depicted by people who saw it with their own eyes, preserved in embroidery for 1,000 years. Halley's Comet, blazing across the embroidered sky of the Bayeux Tapestry. The same comet that would return again and again, in 1222, in 1456, in 1682, when Edmund Halley himself would observe it and give it his name, in 1910, in 1986. The same comet that people are alive today who have seen. And there it is, in wool thread on linen, in the 11th century, over the heads of people who did not yet know what was coming. There is something about this that quiets the mind in a particular way. The comet comes and comes again, indifferent to the kings and conquests below it. The thread endures. The linen endures. The story endures. Let your breathing slow again. Let your mind drift along the length of the tapestry, panel by panel, scene by scene. Here is Harold's fleet crossing to Normandy, the waves stitched in rhythmic blue-green curves beneath the hull of each ship. Here are Norman and English nobles feasting together, the food laid out on a curved table that echoes the shape of the ship beneath the waves. Here is the oath scene, Harold's hands on the reliquary boxes, his posture careful, his face, as much as embroidered faces can tell us anything, giving nothing away. Here is Edward the Confessor, thin and long-fingered, gesturing from his sickbed at a group of attendants. Here is the death of Edward himself, his body wrapped for burial, a line of mourners bent in grief above him. Here is Harold being crowned, the Archbishop of Canterbury placing the crown on his head, while a courtier beside him carries an axe, the symbol of English royal power. Here is a man pointing at the comet, while below him Harold's expression seems to darken. Here are William's ships being built, forests of trees falling under axes, planks being trimmed and fitted, horses being loaded. The remarkable image of horses being walked or lifted into the shallow-bottomed ships, their legs dangling. Their expressions suggesting that horses have always found boats deeply suspicious. Here is the Norman fleet crossing the channel at night, the stars above them, the dark water below. Here is William landing at Pevensey. Here are Norman soldiers foraging for food, driving cattle, seizing supplies. Here is a woman and her child fleeing a burning house. One of the most quietly devastating images in the entire tapestry, this small domestic figure of loss amid the larger narrative of conquest. She is not named. She has no place in the written histories. She exists only here, in thread, running from a fire that Norman soldiers have set. Here are the two armies facing each other across the ridge at Hastings. Here is the battle beginning. Here are horses falling, warriors toppling, shields splitting, men dying in the specific and individual ways that people die in battle, struck by arrows, knocked from horseback, cut down on foot, crushed beneath falling men and animals. The battle scenes are extraordinary in their energy, in their sense of movement and chaos and violence, all rendered in the careful, patient medium of needlework. And here, near the end, is Harold and the arrow and the falling. And then the tapestry ends. Or rather, it ends abruptly. The final scene shows the English fleeing, broken, routed, running from the Norman cavalry. And then the tapestry simply stops. This abrupt ending has puzzled scholars for centuries. The tapestry seems to have been designed to continue further. There is space for more scenes. Some scholars believe the tapestry originally had an additional section, showing perhaps William's coronation, his triumphal entry into London, the submission of English nobles, that has since been lost. The last few feet of the tapestry show signs of having been repaired and restitched at some point, suggesting that the end of the embroidery has had a troubled history. What would have been in those lost panels, if they existed? We can only imagine. Perhaps William standing in Westminster Abbey as the crown was placed on his head on Christmas Day, 1066, while English observers wept in the gallery above. Perhaps the submission of the English nobles, coming forward one by one to kneel before the Norman king. Perhaps simply the image of a new order, a new world beginning. Or perhaps the tapestry always ended where it ends, with the English in flight, and the rest was silence. A story that ended not with triumph, but with aftermath. Not with the victor's crown, but with the moment when the battle was decided and everything that came after was inevitable. We will never know. Now let me bring you, slowly and gently, to the thing that makes all of this feel most deeply, most quietly significant to me. And I think perhaps to you, as you lie there in the dark, listening. The Bayeux Tapestry is a monument to patience. Not just the patience of the needleworkers who made it, though that patience was extraordinary and we should not forget it, but the patience of the object itself, the patience of matter, the patience of thread and linen and dye, surviving against all odds, traveling through centuries of upheaval and war and revolution and neglect and rescue and near disaster, until it reaches the present moment intact. We live in a world that sometimes seems to believe that only digital things can truly survive. Only what is backed up in multiple servers. Only what is duplicated and distributed and stored in the cloud. Only these things will endure. The physical world, we sometimes feel, is fragile. Objects break, burn, rot, flood, are lost. And yet here is a piece of linen, embroidered with wool thread nearly 1,000 years ago, describing events that happened before it was made, and it is still here. It is still legible. You can walk into a museum in Normandy tomorrow, today, if you wished, and stand before it and see with your own eyes the stitches that someone's hands made in the 11th century. You can see the individual threads. You can see the places where stitches have been repaired, where later hands tried to restore what earlier hands made. You can see the places where the linen backing has grown thin and needs support. It is alive, in the way that things that have survived long enough to accumulate history become alive. It has layers. It has scars. It has been touched by too many centuries to be simply itself anymore. It is itself plus everything that has happened to it, and everything that has been thought and said and written about it, and everything that every person who has ever stood before it has brought to it. A woman who lost a husband at Hastings, if she ever stood before it, and she would not have, because she would not have had access to Bayeux Cathedral's treasury. But let us imagine her. What would she have seen? A record of her grief, rendered in the same needlework her own hands knew how to do, turned into propaganda for the men who made her a widow. A Norman knight, standing before it in 1077 at the cathedral's dedication, his own memory of the battle still sharp, the smell of it, the sound of it. What would he have felt? Pride, perhaps. And also, perhaps, something more complicated. The way that seeing events you lived through turned into formal narrative, frozen into art, always produces something more complicated than simple pride. Napoleon, striding through the Parisian exhibition in 1803, looking at William's ships crossing the Channel. What calculations moved through that brilliant, impatient mind? A German officer in 1944 making urgent phone calls to Berlin about a piece of embroidery. What did he see in it that made it worth the effort? A child, today, being walked through the museum by a parent, stopping before the horse loading scene because the horses look funny, because all horses look slightly funny when they are surprised. What seed of historical imagination is being planted in that moment? The tapestry holds all of them. It has held them all. It will hold more. The patience required to make it, those thousands of hours of needlework, is matched by the patience of the object itself, enduring through time. And perhaps there is a kind of lesson in this. Not a grand lesson. Not a lesson that requires us to do anything or change anything. just a quiet observation. The things made with patience sometimes outlast everything else. The careful, slow, deliberate things. The things made stitch by stitch, year by year, without hurry. While empires rose and fell around it. While languages changed and fashions changed and religions changed, and the very landscape of Europe changed. The linen lay in its case or hung on its wall or rode in its protective box, and the wool thread held, and the images endured. There is something in this that the body understands before the mind does. Something that makes the breath slow and the muscles ease and the eyes grow heavy. The world is very old. Things endure that we do not expect to endure. The needle that rose and fell in a Canterbury workshop in 1067 or 1068 or 1069 is still rising and falling in the thread it left behind, visible to anyone who looks closely enough. Your breath is slow now. The night is quiet around you. Let the images come as they will. Herald ships on the embroidered sea. The horses with their suspicious eyes being loaded into the vessels. William on his throne, his half-brother Odo beside him, plans being made for the crossing. The comet blazing silently over the upturned faces of those who did not know it was Halley's comet, who did not know it would come back every 75 years, who only knew that it meant something enormous was coming. The woman running from the burning house. The men wading through cold channel water, shields over their heads. The shield wall on the ridge. The long, terrible morning of fighting, the afternoon that tipped, the evening that ended everything. The needle, rising and falling. The thread, enduring. The hands that we will never know, that stitched the world they lived in into something that lasted longer than any of them could have dreamed. Let your mind move along the length of it, slowly. Panel by panel, scene by scene. The whole long story, laid out in wool and linen, 230 feet of it, telling you, gently, in the language of patience and craft and quiet hands, that some things last. Some things last. The world is very old. You are lying in it, breathing slowly, part of its long story. The tapestry is in its case in Bayeux, breathing slowly in its own way, its threads holding the 11th century in place. Let the night hold you now. Let the old, quiet world of the embroidered linen be around you. The soft colors, the patient stitches, the horses and ships and kings and ordinary women running from fires and men pointing at comets and needleworkers whose names we will never know, making something that would outlast everything. Sleep now. The tapestry endures. The story is safe. The needle rests. You can rest too.